Good morning. It's Monday, March 17th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 528 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer, with the St. Patrick's Day installment of the FDD Morning Brief. Some serious domestic drama in Israel over the weekend. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced his intention to fire Shin Bet chief Ronen Bar. Israeli business leaders are now warning Bibi that there could be serious fallout for him if he follows through, and the Israeli public is set to take to the streets again. Let me say it clearly right here. Ronen Bar was among those responsible for the 10/7 intelligence failure. I think we can say that unequivocally. But let's also acknowledge that Bibi was similarly culpable. Everyone in top positions on that day should be held to account. So let's not talk about firing Ronen Bar as part of the housekeeping that must eventually take place in Israel. No, this is far more political. And at first blush, it doesn't exactly appear to be healthy for Israel's democracy. It comes just as the Shin Bet has launched an investigation into Netanyahu's connections with the duplicitous government of Qatar and the money that it was sending to Hamas in Gaza. We're going to keep watching all of this, and it's going to be complicated, but we'll be updating you right here on the FDD Morning Brief. Our guest today is Grant Rumley, who directs the Washington Institute for Near East Policy's program on Great Power Competition and the Middle East. Grant, who used to work with us here at FDD, and we miss him dearly, he's as smart and down-to-earth as they come. Grant and I caught up late last week to discuss Russia and China's involvement in the Middle East and how the Middle East fits into the wider picture of what we call great power competition. Important stuff to track these days, even as new battles flare up in the region. Hang tight for that conversation, which we'll play for you in just a few minutes. The U.S. military launched a series of weekend strikes against the Houthis in Yemen. The strikes hit Houthi command centers, radars, air defenses, missiles, and drones. At least 31 people were killed, including Houthi leaders. U.S. Central Command shared footage of fighter jets taking off from an aircraft carrier and a strike demolishing a Houthi compound. Pass the popcorn, would you? One U.S. official announced that American strikes could continue for weeks. That may sound scary, but it's probably good news. After months of feckless American responses and non-responses to Houthi terror, a U.S. response was long overdue. President Donald Trump gave the Houthis an ultimatum: stop terrorizing the Middle East or all hell will rain down. For those keeping score at home, that's the fifth threat of hell Trump has issued since Election Day. Trump also warned the regime in Iran that it will be held accountable if it continues to back the Yemeni jihadists. I have no clue how the Houthis will react, nor do I know how Iran will respond, but I will say this: Hamas is hobbled. So is Hezbollah. The Assad regime fell, and the Iraqi militias have gone quiet. The Houthis are the last of the Iranian proxies in the ring of fire, and they are taking a beating. This war is not over, but an endgame is beginning to take shape. The regime in Iran looks increasingly isolated and weak. After a year and a half of conflict, that seems like a very good thing to me. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, the Shin Bet and Israeli police foiled a plot to carry out a terrorist attack in Jerusalem. Last month, Israeli authorities detained a 24-year-old Arab Israeli from the northern communities after he purchased a homemade rifle and started practicing. The Shin Bet and Israeli police announced his arrest yesterday. During interrogation, the suspect said he was planning to go on a shooting spree in the old city of Jerusalem during Ramadan, a tense month in the holy city, if there ever was one. It's all in writing. A year before this would-be terrorist was arrested, he wrote a letter to a friend saying Ramadan is coming and that war is at the door. He apparently tried to recruit several other people to join him in the attack. Israeli police also detained the suspect's brother, who allegedly hid the rifle. Headline 2, a former Islamic Revolutionary Guard corps from Iran gave a rare interview with the Israeli media. The former officer, who went by the name Javad, pulled back the curtain on all things Iran, Hamas, and Hezbollah. On the assassination of top Hamas terrorist Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran last summer, Javad said that the IRGC was completely shocked. He said that the operation was incredibly precise and showed how deeply Israeli intelligence had penetrated the regime in Iran. Barely 2 months later, Israel eliminated Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah. Hamas and Hezbollah, Javad said, may never fully recover. Sounds good to me. But Javad had more to share. The biggest blow to the regime, he said, was the downfall of the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria. The rise of Turkish-backed HTS in Syria was a devastating development for the clerics in Tehran. With Assad gone, the IRGC lost its Levantine base of operations. Now, Javad claims that the government in Damascus is acting against Hezbollah. We're going to talk about that momentarily, and that is a tough pill for Tehran to swallow. Javad had more to say about the regime, including rampant corruption and cracks within the IRGC, but for the sake of brevity, let's just leave it there. Headline 3, former Israeli hostage Tal Shoham gave an exclusive interview to Fox News. Shoham spent 505 days in captivity. Hamas released him last month. His account of his time in Hamas hell is chilling. He was kept in private homes and in tunnels, and he was deprived of food, water, and sleep. For the first 50 days, he had no idea what had happened to his wife and children. As it turns out, they were released in November of last year. But here's the truly chilling part. Shoham said that his guards were Hamas tunnel diggers and that they never stopped digging. This means that the network of tunnels under Gaza continues to grow. Whatever Israel has mapped has already changed. This will make phase 2 of the war more complex. The longer Israel waits to go in, the more deadly underground surprises there are likely to be found. And bonus, headline 4, and this one's wild. A Syrian soldier was killed yesterday by a Hezbollah rocket. The new Syrian regime was having none of that, so there was a military response to the attack, and that killed 3 in Lebanon, including 2 children, according to reports. And that wasn't the only action. The IDF struck a command center belonging to Hezbollah's Radwan forces in southern Lebanon. Yes, okay, I know. It looks like the new Syrian regime and Israel are fighting against the same enemy. And yes, I know there will be some out there claiming that this is the start of a new friendship between Syria and Israel. I'm just not buying it. The Syrian regime is backed by Turkey and Qatar, and it's aligned with al-Qaeda. I'll take a hard pass on that. Thank you. All right, it's time to press play on my pre-recorded conversation with Grant Rumley from the Washington Institute's Great Power Competition and the Middle East program. I'd like to think that Grant's time at FDD was what made him so sharp, but I suppose I will have to acknowledge that he's smart no matter where he works. Anyway, he's got great insights, so sit back, relax, and have a listen. Welcome to the FDD Morning Brief, Grant Rumley.
Hey, John, how are you?
Doing great, doing great. Let's dive into it. I want to ask you first about the Washington Institute for Near East Policy's program on Great Power Competition in the Middle East. This is the one that you run. What is it that you guys are looking at specifically day in and day out?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, John. I mean, we stood up this Glazer Foundation program on Great Power Competition a few years ago. At the time, it was me, Anna Borshevskaya, Mike Singh, sort of looking at China, Russia, and U.S. strategy in the Middle East. We've since expanded. We've brought in Dana Stroll as our research director. We've brought in Liz Dent, who was running Gulf Affairs and OSD beforehand. And, really what we're trying to do here is forecast, what are the issues for policymakers down the road when we're sort of navigating U.S. interests in the region. I think we come to it with the understanding that, the Middle East is not the key theater for competition between the U.S. and China and the U.S. and Russia, but it is a theater for competition. It is important to both China and Russia, and it's important to the U.S. as well. And so, what we try to do is put out, I think, sound policy recommendations that anticipate some of the dilemmas that U.S. policymakers will face. I mean, I'll give you an example. I was in government during the F-35 to UAE sort of saga, right? And that was a really good moment that transcended administrations where we had to think through, all right, here are our priorities with the Middle East. Here are our priorities with China. Where do we have some tensions with our partners in the region in terms of their own relationship with our adversaries? And so I think what we try to do is sort of forecast, all right, well, what's the next F-35 saga? What's the next issue? Is it technology? Is it Taiwan? Is it freedom of navigation? And how do we sort of take our experience in government, our subject matter expertise, and bring it to bear for folks thinking through these scenarios?
And that is classic think tankery. Let's talk for a minute about the interests of some of these great powers, or they're not necessarily even great. Take the case of Russia. We call that a gas station with an army. I'm not sure they're a great power, right? But they're playing in the Middle East. So what are Russian interests in the Middle East right now that we're concerned about?
Yeah, I think it is to your point there. It is about having a foothold, having some type of military security presence through which it can project power into the region, into NATO's southern flank in the Mediterranean, but also support its operations in Africa, which we know are, I think more economic in nature and their focus there. I think, Russia, there's a debate about, is Russia trying to affect the political scenario on the ground, the outcomes on the ground, or is it more interested in playing spoiler? I do think the events in Syria will probably diminish Russia's standing as a political actor in the region for a little bit, but it will always retain that sort of clout and that ability to be the spoiler. China's interests are primarily economic. I mean, the region is incredibly important to China's economy. A lot of the Middle Eastern countries find China to be incredibly important to their own economies. They're the number one trading partner for just about every country in the region. And so it leads with its economy. And I think, China has found that, like many great powers in the past, when its economic interests are extended overseas, it wants to develop a military that can protect those interests abroad. And so, the Middle East has been the first theater outside of the Indo-Pacific where China has deployed its military. It has its longest running overseas deployment in the Naval Escort Task Force that's based out of Djibouti. And so, I think for China, it is about looking to the region for both that economic outlet, looking at it as a useful theater to sort of build up some experience for its military, and then in return, seeking some of that political and diplomatic validation from the region.
All right, I want to unpack some of that. First, I want to just ask you about the Russian bases in Syria that are now in jeopardy. This is, I think, when we sort of talk about the Russian presence in the Middle East, this was where they put their big bets, right? I mean, they helped support the Assad regime at the beginning of the Syrian civil war. 2011, 2012 was when it really looked the diciest. So then they swoop in, they build a warm water port on Tartus. They've got assets across the region. Now, all of a sudden, it looks like they've been, I don't know if they've been completely pushed out, but they certainly look weaker. Does that really detract from their position? Can they make up for it in other ways? Or are we really looking at a decline of Moscow in the Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all TBD at this moment. I think Russia sees themselves as in a bit of purgatory in Syria. It's 1 foot in, 1 foot out. I mean, like you said, that naval port is a huge bonus to them. They expanded its capability to host and refit ships there. The Hmeimim has been described as, sort of a Ramstein for Russia, a one-stop shop for them. So it's incredibly important for them. I think they invested a lot of blood and treasure into securing it. I think, they think they still have some cards to play with the new regime. And especially, if other countries, Europe and the US, are a bit slow to open up some of those levers for the regime, perhaps Russia thinks that, we've got this past and this, reputational hit there, but it's not insurmountable. I also think they're looking at contingency plans. Libya and Sudan come to mind. There's been the longstanding negotiations for a port agreement with the Sudanese. There's stuff with Haftar that's, on again, off again. And so I think they're thinking through, what happens for a plan B or a plan C. But I wouldn't rule them completely out of Syria at the moment.
Yeah, I wouldn't either. And as I understand it, there are negotiations ongoing between, really, it's the Erdogan government in Turkey they're the guys who are going to ultimately decide the fate of Tartus and whether Russia is able to stay or whether they're going to go. Right. I guess I want to pull on this Russia thread for another second, then I want to talk about China. But with Russia, I find it really interesting. A lot of people sort of seem to think that, well, we don't need to care about Ukraine, but we do care about what's going on in Israel versus Iran. People prioritize these different conflicts. As I hear it in the region right now, there is a lot of overlap, more overlap than people realize. Of course, you got the Iranians selling weapons, drones, missiles, et cetera, to the Russians, and those are being used in theater. But there's the other part of this too, which is, as I hear it, if the war in Ukraine does end, and that would be a good thing, we actually could see Russia begin to redeploy some of those S-300 systems that Israel destroyed last time around back in, I guess it was November. That's where you could start to see the replenishing of S-300s in Iran. So it's all interconnected, is it not?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly it'll free them up. I mean, you can even look at it more broadly. Russia has shifted its economy into a war economy to replenish its military and support its effort in Ukraine. Once that situation is, in a ceasefire, in some type of peace negotiation, it frees them up to not only support partners like Iran, but other traditional recipients of Russian kit in the past. I think the Iranians are expecting that in return for their missile and drone support, they will receive advanced Russian technology. There's been, a lot of conversation about the Sukhoi 35s and whether or not Iran will be able to get those and field them. I think it's sort of up in the air if Russia is going to live up to its end of the bargain, or if it'll look to sort of, find a different compromise for what it will give. I think for me, the bottom line is it's sort of easy to make a lot about, the current air defense situation in Iran and its relationship with Russia. I do think one of the takeaways from the Israeli operations there is that you can have Russian air defense systems, but they weren't a hindrance to the Israeli Air Force the way that perhaps I think in the past we thought that's a pretty dense airspace to navigate. That's a pretty tricky place. And there's a lot of risk assumed with it. I think the Israelis disabused a lot of us of that notion. And so, yeah, perhaps there's some S-300s that are going to get moved to Iran. Certainly, I think some of the technology will flow that way. But will it change the reality on the ground? I think we're sort of living in that post-November reality.
Yeah, I think that's right. All right, I want to ask you about Chinese weapons platforms. There's a lot of talk about whether China is getting a foothold, not just through the sale of, whatever it is, cheap goods and services to the Middle East. And that's a big part of how they maintain influence. There's also obviously Belt and Road, where they're trying to build infrastructure in the Middle East. And that's a way that they're able to maintain influence. But what about, do they have weapons platforms in the same way that, the Russians are selling them around the region?
So it's gradual, right? I think as their defense industrial base develops and as it sort of builds out its own indigenous capabilities, it sort of weans itself off of its reliance on Russian imports to sort of build up its own technologies, that you start to see more advanced Chinese platforms on the market. In the past, they were sort of famous for some of the missiles, ballistic missiles, some of the point air defense, and then famously in the Middle East, the drones. I know Brad Bowman at FDD has done a ton of great work on this, but they read the market in the Middle East accurately. The U.S. does not export armed drones to the Middle East, doesn't do so widely. And a lot of partners in the region have looked for that capability, in particular during the ISIS campaign. There's sort of a famous moment where Jordan requested the MQ-1s from the Obama administration and was refused, turned around and bought the CH-4s from China. Now, that shows that China is willing to sort of read the market, take advantage, and push its platforms out there. The other side of that coin, of course, is that Jordan couldn't field them adequately. They were malfunctioning. The instruction manuals are all in Chinese. They don't come with the sort of maintenance and sustainment tail that American weaponry does, and they don't integrate. They're not interoperable with most of the Jordanian military's existing kit. And so, I think there are limits to the appeal of Chinese weaponry at this point, but they are certainly aggressively marketing their material, and they're sort of inching their way up the sort of capability ladder. We've seen them sell the L-15 trainer jets to the UAE. They're looking at marketing the J-10 fighter to Egypt, but others in the region around the world. And so, I think we've got to wrestle with this reality where they're going to be an arms exporter. They need the revenues for their arms firms to advance their own modernization efforts. And that's going to happen in the Middle East, which has historically been a region that loves to import and buy weaponry. And so I think that's going to be a new face of this competition between the U.S. and China.
Yeah, I think so. And I expect it coming soon to a theater near us. Last question before I let you go. Are we expecting countries to flip in this great power competition? I mean, I think that's, at the end of the day, that's what they're competing for. They're competing for spheres of influence. And the ultimate prize here is flipping a government that was American, and now it's going to be, leaning, or it's going to be in the Chinese orbit or the Russian orbit. We hear, for example, that Egypt is maybe a little wobbly. Are there countries that you're watching right now that you think are at the center of great power competition between the United States, China, and Russia?
Sure. Well, I think it is Egypt. I think it is the Gulf. I think for the longest time, countries looked at China and saw their economic indicators flowing east and flowing to Beijing. And they looked to the West, they looked to the US and saw their security framework, right? That was sort of the balancing act, was that they looked to the US for broad regional security and they looked to China for the economic outlet, and ne'er the twain shall meet, right? But the past few years, the sort of implications of China's overseas presence, its economic interests, and how those sort of blend into the security and diplomatic realm has meant that the middle of that Venn diagram is quite smaller than perhaps countries in the Middle East have thought. And so I do think we're going to see this constant struggle between, a U.S. that has to identify its red lines for countries that have a relationship with China, and countries in the region wanting to sort of test the U.S. limits. How much can they do technologically with China, militarily with China, and still have that sort of overarching security relationship with the U.S.? I do think, living in this moment right now, I think, for countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which have sort of prided themselves on, being what Mike Singh likes to call omni-aligned, or, having these diplomatic relations with both China, Russia, and the U.S. and serving as a mediator. The fact that the Trump administration has looked to Saudi to help mediate the Ukraine talks is going to reinforce this belief that, yes, we can be close partners with the U.S. and we can have ties with China and Russia, and we can play this useful and important role as a mediator in these sort of global tension points. And so I do think that'll probably be the trend for the next few years at the very least.
Interesting stuff. All right, we're going to leave it there. Thank you, Grant Rumley, for joining us this morning on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me.
All right, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. Check out the latest episode of FDD's Foreign Policy, where FDD founder and president Cliff Bay is joined by Emirati political analyst Amjad Taha and Georgetown professor and former FDD Morning Brief guest Ed Hussein. The three discuss the Abraham Accords and explore whether the wider Muslim world views these groundbreaking treaties as a step in the right direction. My colleague Natalie Icano has written a piece for the New York Sun on that two-faced terror-supporting regime in Qatar and its role in mediating the Israel-Hamas ceasefire talks. Natalie emphasizes that Washington must apply pressure on Doha and stop legitimizing it as a mediator. This Gulf state's days of playing both arsonist and firefighter in this conflict really must end. Finally, my colleague Brad Bowman and Ryan Brobst have a piece in Defense News on why America must continue arming Ukraine, even if a long elusive peace with Russia is achieved. Europe's military strength pales in comparison to that of the U.S., meaning that if deterrence is to be maintained after the conflict ends, Washington must ensure its Eastern European allies are fully equipped and ready to defend themselves. Europe is going to have to step up its defense spending too. Okay. That's a wrap for today. If you want to get smarter and impress your friends, family, or neighbors, check out our expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD, or take a peek at our Instagram and YouTube channels. And please get on board and support our mission with a tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. We are deeply appreciative of our donors for helping make this work possible. We cannot produce this program or any of our other research products without you. Tune in Wednesday for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief featuring John Hanna, an expert on U.S. Middle East foreign policy. He's another FDD alum, but he also served as Vice President Dick Cheney's national security advisor, a senior advisor to Secretary of State Warren Christopher during the Clinton administration, and he was a member of Secretary of State James Baker's policy planning staff during the presidency of George Bush Sr. Talk about experience in foreign policy. Wow. All right. Hope to see you then. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.